Yes, it is electrifying, and you feel a little helpless because you know that your bullets, even though the Wildcat had .5 bullets, you know very well they're not going to penetrate the hull of a submarine. But at least you can fire at the conning tower and force them to dive. And that was all we could do. But interestingly enough, the one major attack that was made on a submarine, the first major attack, I should say, was made in a submarine, was by our CO's wingman. And he dived down on it because there were people on the conning tower, and he fired on it with these .5s. But they had manned their 20 mil on the casing of the thing and actually shot him down. And we found out later, when his body was recovered, that the shell had gone through and hit the stick and took the top of the control stick and his right hand off. So, of course, he had no control at all and went straight in and was killed. So we respected this. We realized that you could not afford to take it easy and think that it was a one-sided battle with these people. And I later on found 2 U-boats on the surface with a plank between them, well out from the convoy, of course, and obviously one of them was in serious trouble of some sort. And because they were moving across this plank and helping one another. And when I caught them, they were still engaged in this, and I killed quite a few of them walking or in this area of trying to rush into the conning tower across the plank to get out of danger. But they immediately dived and left the plank and whatnot, and we believe one of them had been badly damaged because it was eventually lost without ever being attacked. Dönitz in his diary just reported that it vanished. So obviously it had been badly damaged and probably was lost diving without proper repair. But it goes to show that there were plenty of U-boats around this convoy, and up to that point, in fact, it was the most heavily attacked convoy of World War II, up to that point. Of course, it's a thrill because it's a dark, menacing shape. It really looks evil. And you think to yourself, well, it may not be a pleasant life down there, but they seem to be in an advantage situation at the moment, because we were a slow convoy. We were a convoy doing probably a maximum of about 10 knots. And when they have a target like this, and there are so many of them, obviously all coordinating the attack, the odds are fairly heavily stacked on their side. We were very fortunate in having probably the best convoy protection commander of the war in Commander Walker, who became very famous as for his anti-submarine attacks. He was very much on the ball, always alert, ready to go for them and take on any challenge, even ramming a submarine at the expense of his own boat, damaging heavily, but he would go for them. And They were difficult to get because I've seen a situation where the submarine was actually turning inside the circle that a corvette could turn in, so they were highly maneuverable. And Walker was, as I say, always ready to attack, and he knew we were being heavily targeted all the time. So it was a tense situation. We had some very difficult weather, and while it was difficult for the pilots, the back end of the vessel, the worst we had was it was moving through an arc of 60 feet. Now, that was virtually impossible for landing, but we were up there and had to get back. You could take off, provided the timing was you waited till the vessel was on the upswing, then charged up, you were going uphill, and then it would gradually come down, and so you'd reach the bows by the time it was about level, and that was fine for takeoff. But deck landing was a very difficult business to judge, and we had a case of one of our pilots actually being hit by the stern as it came up and literally tossed into the air. The aircraft went straight over the side and into the sea, which was boiling at that time. But the corvettes rushed in and picked up the pilots, so all was well. But these were the hazards we had: high seas and a pitching deck. Now, bad enough for the pilots, but think of the poor ground crew. We had no hangar. These 6 aircraft were parked at the stern, tied down by cables at night, and were being serviced. The only time that they were available for servicing was in the dark at night. These troops were going around with a back end moving up and down, water pouring over them, slippery conditions, with a small torch with a piece of blue paper over the front to look into the engine, etc. I think they were pushed to the limit, but they did all this without any moans or groans. Were quite remarkable. So this resulted in a tremendous rapport, inevitably, between the ground crew and the pilots. We knew as pilots that our life depended on these guys giving us a machine that wouldn't let us down in a very hostile environment. As I say, it was a matter of personal judgment doing a landing in these heavily pitching decks. You obviously would try to land on just as it got virtually to level, and then it would go down. So you were running uphill, that would be fine. But to judge to that degree was extremely difficult. I was hit in the air by a 20mm cannon shell, which came from an aircraft. I would call it a random shot because the aircraft was a 4-engine. It was higher than us, probably a Condor, but it was just, we had just sighted it, were heading up towards it, was going into cloud, when this shell smashed through my windscreen. Now, we had armor-plated windscreens, but a 20mm cannon shell really damaged it very badly. And we didn't wear, since we were at low altitude, we didn't wear oxygen masks. So my face was exposed, and a large piece of the glass from the screen came into my mouth. I maybe opened my mouth in amazement, or what should you say, not amazement, but a reaction to being hit. And I think this concussed me, because I've no recollection of what happened after that for quite a while. But apparently my wing leader, I was the number 2, came alongside me, realized I'd been hit, and was afraid that I would become unconscious, and that would have been that. So he kept talking to me all the time, trying to keep me going. He said I wasn't responding, but when he means responding, I wasn't talking to him. But he said I appeared to be doing what he told me to do with the aircraft. In other words, fly straight now, or turn right now, or turn left. And he talked me down onto fortunately, it wasn't a day where the aircraft carrier was pitching, talked me down onto the deck. And I've no recollection of landing on at all. But I caught the for Christ's sake wire, and I didn't do my face any good on the gun sight because although we had shoulder straps on, I had foolishly just used my lap strap. And so I caused my own grief there. So what the windscreen had done to me, plus what the gun sight did to me, was they needed a little bit of repair work. So I was out for the rest of that particular trip. But that was the very first convoy. So I was okay for the second one. Having had a hard lesson, the whole squadron, from the loss of our squadron commander, I then studied this aircraft very carefully to see where its armament was and how it could bring it to bear against an attacking aircraft. And I realized that there was no blind spot except from the front. They had a cannon in a turret on the top of a dorsal turret on the top, and I realized that it was limited to the amount it could come down before it was in danger of hitting its own fuselage. So I knew how much it could be depressed. And then from the bottom cannon they had in a gondola underneath. The same reason I realized there was a limitation on how much it could be elevated. So with these two limited for depression and elevation, there was a blind spot dead ahead. Now, it wasn't blind in the sense there was no armament there, but the armament was two fixed machine guns, and the pilot was the only one that could bring them to bear, and he could only bring them to bear by moving the total aircraft, which was very limiting for him. So this was, if you like, not totally blind, but it certainly was the most vulnerable form of attack. So when I eventually managed to get this aircraft into a situation when he was nipping in and out of cloud, it was rather difficult to keep up with him. Eventually, I made an absolutely flat attack, not a diving attack, had to be absolutely flat. And I did that, and when I opened fire, I could see the pilot's windscreen shattering. And obviously, if that shattered, I must have killed both of the first and the second pilot, because as soon as I did that, it began to fall down. And went in a very flat attitude. It was, I think, beginning of a spin, actually, in a very flat attitude into the sea, to such a degree that two of the crew managed to crawl out of it, probably very badly hurt, but they were still appeared to be still alive. But of course, they were left there. There was nobody to save them. So they probably drowned there, I would think. So that was my first attack. And I had a similar one the second time, but in the second case, they were all lost. I think there was 7 crew in the aircraft. But having worked out this head-on attack, as we called it, the other guys quizzed me on this, of course, and they all adopted the same thing. So as a result, after the CO's aircraft, the one in which he was killed, the one he brought down, we brought down 4 more using the head-on attack. This was the second convoy, which was between Liverpool and Gibraltar, returning from Gibraltar. And we were put under immense attack 2 nights, one night after leaving Gibraltar. And we had, interestingly enough, we had some survivors from the sinking of the Ark Royal on board. So they were into their second lot on this. And we were attacked, and we realized under heavy attack, and our captain made the decision. He had 2 options. One was that the carrier was normally, there were 5 lines of vessels, about 4 or 5 in a line. Walker would put the carrier right in the middle line, so it was furthest away from attack. But our captain, who was senior to Walker, made his own decision. He decided that was putting the merchant ships at too much risk with a large number of submarines attacking or U-boats attacking. So he came out into the open and decided he'd go at full speed, which was only 14 knots, but zigzag throughout the night, clear of the convoy. Well, we'd been doing that for maybe an hour or so when a U-boat source fired a random torpedo at us in the hope of having a strike, because we were zigzagging at 14 knots. And his luck would have it, hit our rudder, carried the rudder away. We could still do 14 knots, but we had no steering. And darkness, the captain decided we would hit the convoy if we went on like this. So he hove to, hoping he had escaped the U-boat. But just as we settled and the U-boat surfaced about 200 yards on our port side, and we could see the captain of the U-boat quite clearly on the conning tower with the braid of his hat. And our captain called all the crew of the Audacity onto the flight deck, because he realized that with the possibility of abandoning ship. And he alerted us to this. And while we were there was this uncanny period, which may have been as much as 10 minutes, where we were looking at each other when one of the sailors' nerves broke and he rushed into one of our 20-millimeter cannon and opened fire at the U-boat, which was a hopeless thing to do. But, as I say, probably his nerve had broken. And, of course, in retort, the captain of the U-boat fired 4 torpedoes, all of which struck us, and the entire bows of the carrier fell off. And, of course, when they went, she tipped up immediately. And as she did, the cables holding down the wildcats at the back all snapped. I'll never forget the twang as they snapped. And they came rushing down the deck into 400 sailors and just wiped out dozens of them, knocking them over the side, killing them on impact, and so on and so forth. Utter chaos. And most of them just ran to the edge and jumped off. And, of course, jumping off the deck, rearing up as it was, they were jumping off from a height of maybe 50, 60, even 70 feet. So it was pandemonium. When I heard the twang of the cables going, I realized what was going to happen. So I went immediately to the side and jumped off. I had already, before I'd assembled in the flight deck, I'd gone down and got my flight jacket, because this was the 21st of December, and in the Bay of Biscay, it wasn't going to be warm in there. So when I was at least in a flight jacket and a Mae West. All the pilots were wearing Mae West, and all the sailors were wearing a very basic arrangement. It was really like an inner tube around their middle with 2 tapes over the shoulders. That was all they had. Anyway, jumping off into the sea was a bit of a hazard, because quite apart from the height, and you may break legs or anything, there was a danger of jumping onto people, because by this time there were dozens in the water. And but having survived that, I swam to a Carley float, but they were all already full of people. And when I got to this Carley float, they have little looped ropes around the side. I held on to one of these, and we were all speaking to each other. We were quite just thankful to be in this situation, really. And the corvettes had arrived to pick people up. And I found myself with my flight leader, and he said to me, let's swim towards the corvette, which we did. And suddenly the corvettes all took off, vanished. Now, the reason was they had picked up quite a large number of survivors, so they were pretty full, and they got a NASDAQ ping that the submarine was still in the area. And the last thing they wanted to be was torpedoed and sunk with all these survivors aboard. So they vanished with the intention of coming back as soon as possible. But we were left for 3 or 4 hours in the water. And what we did was he and I tied ourselves together and then got a group of sailors. We were 26 in all, and we all tied ourselves together with the bits of cord and string we had from these things. And we kept together for about certainly an hour and a bit. And then the first of the sailors they had fallen asleep, and obviously hypothermia was setting in. And as they fell asleep, they toppled forward, of course, with these just having a rubber tube around you. And heads going into the water and just drowned. And of course, they were dead weight. And I'm afraid we had to be ruthless and just cut each one that drowned off. And after 3 hours, I'm afraid the only one surviving was the flight commander and myself. The reason being, we had Mae Wests, which supported our necks, our heads, kept them above water. And it is a horrible thing to realize that your companions are just not surviving. Maybe another thing was they weren't as fit as we were. As pilots, we had to keep ourselves pretty damn fit. We had medicals every 6 months. And I think these chaps were just not as fit as we were and didn't have the right sort of life jackets. And after about 3 hours or 4 hours, the corvettes came back and they hoisted us out of the water. Amongst the lot I was with, well, reasonably, were the captain and the navigator. And he was being hauled up into the corvette, not the one I was on, because we were hauled up by lines. Our legs had gone, and being in water cold water for about 4 hours. They had to pull us up on lines. And he was being hauled up when the line snapped, and he went forward, and I think he struck the hull of the corvette and knocked him unconscious because he just went in the water and vanished. So it was very bad luck. So we lost about a third of the ship's company, roughly. The squadron, obviously, we had about 2 weeks' leave, survivors' leave, and then we were all recalled to reform the squadron with Hurricanes at Yeovilton in Somerset. And having reformed and retrained, we were told we were going to another escort carrier, but one which had been built by the Americans in the Kaiser's shipyards. It was called HMS Avenger. Now, they came out in alphabetical order, so it was probably the first American carrier to come over, these escort carriers. And they went off to the Mediterranean, or we were to go to the Mediterranean, but just prior to embarking, I was told that I was required to be kept behind for a series of trials of Hurricanes and Spitfires on escort carriers. Now, why was I tossed into the test world? I didn't discover till later on that the captain of the Audacity had written in my confidential report on the first trip to, well, maybe after 1.5 trips, but he had left the details at Gibraltar and they had gone to Admiralty eventually. These were the confidential reports on the pilots. And he had said in mine that I had a facility for deck landing and they should try and make use of this. So that's why I did realize at the time, that's why I was hauled out to go on this test job to see if a Hurricane could be landed on an escort carrier, and then a Seafire. Seafire and Hurricane had already been landed on big carriers, but these were half-size carriers. So both trials were successful. So from then on, I was allotted to this test unit called the Service Trials Unit for the Navy. And I stayed with them for over a year, and then was moved to the Test Evaluation Squadron at Boscombe Down. And I had just settled in there, had been about a month at Boscombe Down, when the naval test pilot at Farnborough was killed deck landing a Seafire on wasn't a small carrier, it was a medium carrier. We had the small, the medium, and the large, and he was killed on that. So I got what is called in the Navy a pierhead jump from Boscombe Down to Farnborough. Obviously, things like the landings in Italy were coming up in the course of the war, and the Canadians were to be involved in this. And we were going to have escort carriers, of course, in this battle. And it was felt that the RAF may find themselves in a position where they were attacking land targets and were not able to come back to airfields because our army hadn't yet been able to overrun these airfields. So their only home to come back to was the aircraft carriers. Therefore, they should have some idea of how to get onto these aircraft carriers. So I was sent to Kenley, to the Seafire wing, to the Spitfire wing there, to teach the Canadians or give them some idea how to land on a carrier, the technique involved. They were not very receptive. They were heavily involved in their own kind of wars with Spitfires, and which was mainly ground attack work, but also in combat with 109s and 190s. And Canadians being what they are, the only way I could get them to agree to do some deck landing training was they said, we'll do one for every sortie you do with us. So this was the deal. And so I did a few what they called rhubarbs and things like this over in France. But it was an insight into the sort of life they were leading, and which was quite hectic and quite dangerous. And there were shoals of 109s and 190s around, so one had to keep one's wits about one to survive. So I had a very short spell with them, probably just under a month, I think. Fighter sweeps were new to me, of course, and to see large numbers of aircraft like this, I don't see how people could be frightened, because there were so many aircraft and all doing the same thing, and you felt this is tremendous to have all this support with you, and you're not a loner in there at great risk. You're all going in together, and I got into the spirit of the thing, and terrible thing to say, but I enjoyed it, frankly. You're not supposed to enjoy wars, but there you are. It's the spirit gets to you. These were a pretty happy-go-lucky bunch, the Canadians. They really were. It was enjoy today because there may not be a tomorrow. That was their attitude to life. When I got to Boscombe Down, I had been almost entirely a single-engined, piston-engine pilot. And suddenly I was thrown into a place where twins and four-engine aircraft abounded. So I had to have my experience extended a bit. And the powers that be there determined I should do this as quickly as possible. So I was popped onto twins and then onto four engines, which was very fortunate because I'd only been at Boscombe Down, I say, just a month, when I got a phone call from the Admiralty, but they rang me up and asked me if I thought it was possible to land a Mosquito on a carrier, twin-engined aircraft. Well, I had minimum twin-engined experience, and but with all the brash sort of, if you like, confidence of youth, I said, oh, yes, I'll do that. And so they said, right, you're on your way to Farnborough as a replacement pilot. And they told me the pilot there had been killed. So I arrived at Farnborough on the 17th of January, and I had never even seen a Mosquito till I got to Boscombe Down. And I hadn't flown one till I arrived at Farnborough. So I had to learn to fly the aircraft and work up on it to land it on a carrier. Now, I didn't realize what I was up against, but here I had experienced boffins at Farnborough, and they called it Mission Impossible, because you land an aircraft on a carrier. Your approach speed is about 1.1 times or 1.15 at the maximum times the stalling speed. The stalling speed of the Mosquito, with everything down, was 110 miles an hour. And the boffins at Farnborough, who were in the Naval Aircraft Department, said that the maximum speed that the arrestor wires would accept a Mosquito on a carrier was 86 miles an hour. stalling speed at 110, so I should have been landing on at 115 or so, and they wanted me to land on 86, which is below the stalling speed. So we had to work that one out. Now, the only way of doing that is to, normally you land on with a little engine power as you come onto the carrier, but with this, I'd have to use almost half engine power and hang on the propellers and until I was about maybe 3 feet off the deck, then cut the engines when the aircraft would just fall out of the sky. So it was quite a hazardous thing. We were going to start with the aircraft as light as they could get it, which was 16,000 pounds, but eventually we were going to work up till it was with max bomb load at 22,000 pounds. And yet the trials went very successfully, and all was well. Now, the reason for this was the Navy did not intend to operate mosquitoes off carriers. It was for a special operation, a sort of naval dam busters raid. In the dam busters raid, Barnes Wallis had invented the spitting bomb. Now, as it was used in the dam busters raid, that spitting bomb looked like an oil drum. But to get it into a mosquito, that shape was unacceptable. It didn't work it wasn't compatible with the bomb bay. So we had a totally spherical bouncing bomb. And the idea was these mosquitoes were going to be taken out on 2 carriers to Japan, and a raid was to be made against warships, mainly battleships, in harbor on the Japanese mainland. And the pilots wouldn't have the range to get there without being taken out in carriers. They would fly off the carriers, and then they would be asked to land back on. They had never done a mosquito landing. They had only landed in training with barracudas, which is the easiest of the deck landing aircraft we had. So they had only a vague, really, conception of what they were called to do. But this way we thought at least we'll save most of them. While, immediately after World War II, we had a period of about 2 months where the Russians were very amenable to letting me into their occupation zone. And at first, for the first month, they would gladly give me aircraft to fly because their attitude was, you were the only nation that helped us when we were in real trouble at the beginning of the war. And they weren't going to, although you see pictures of handshaking with Americans and French. They weren't really going to have anything to do with them as regards exchange of flying. So for a month I had a good run like that, and then for the second month it tightened up a little. They wouldn't let me fly unless I brought a British aircraft and let them fly it. So I took a Firefly around with me, and we got a few hops that way. Oh, I flew about 12 to 15 different aircraft. But my general impression, well, they were woefully crude in their instrumentation. They had no such thing as the standard instrument panel with an artificial horizon. They flew on basic instruments, which I find quite extraordinary when you consider the weather in Russia, particularly in the winter. I wouldn't have thought was of the best. I would have thought they needed to do a lot of instrument flying, with all this being done on basic instruments. And so from that point of view, they were a little behind. Not a little, a long way behind. But the very last one I flew, they were suddenly getting the word, and things were getting better. The other thing I thought about it, the structure of the aircraft. If you run your hand along the fuselage of a Spitfire, it's pretty smooth. In spite of all the riveting there, it's pretty smooth. If you ran it along the fuselage of a Russian aircraft, you could almost feel every rivet. And that must have added to drag, of course. But it looked a little basic in that sense. And finally, their engines. They had a philosophy that military engines shouldn't be built to last any more than 100 hours. Not an unreasonable attitude, because, after all, that's probably the truth, that if you're really in a combat aircraft, the engine will be lucky to last 100 hours. But they sounded like as if they were made that way. Whereas you get the lovely purr of the Merlin and the sort of throaty growl of the Griffin. With the Russian engines, it was a clanking noise. And I always thought, my God, they're building them for 100 hours. This one sounds as if it's in its 90s. And they were a bit that way. So there were certain things that didn't leave you with great peace of mind about them. But and on the other hand, it was interesting to fly to see how they compared. I think the two best ones I flew were, they had an aircraft called the PE-2, which was a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, which was very nice aircraft to fly. And apart from the instrumentation we mentioned, really up to anything of that era, and we're talking about the early 1940s. Then at the end of the war, I flew a fighter called the Lavochkin 7, and that was, again, even in the instrumentation, had now come up pretty well to Allied standards. But it had been a long process. Their pilots, generally speaking, from everything I've learned about them, were very, very good, but tactically naive. They believed, for example, in flying formations of the Il-2, which was the Stormwing, and only had one gun at the back, which in effect was a pea shooter, and they sat together in large gaggles and thought that they could defend themselves with all these pea shooters firing at you, and many of these, incidentally, being flown by women pilots. And to quote Booby Hartman, who was the top scorer in World War II, he said it was a turkey shoot. You just, he said, I never fired until the aircraft filled my windscreen. And he said because their firepower was negligible coming back at you. And you begin to realize how the Germans began to put up scores. Like Hartmann, I think, had 352. And in the Battle of Kursk, where this was the biggest air battle of all time over in Russia, the Soviets lost over 400 aircraft, and the Germans, who were using 109s and 190s, lost 27.
But interestingly, on the ground, I guess the Soviet tanks succeeded over the German.
Quantity, to a large degree, yes. And, of course, they were built to operate in snow. One has to admit, if you are going to take on a country like Russia, you better know what it's like to deal with the winter conditions. When you look back on it, I think if the German Operation Barbarossa had started a month and a half earlier than it did, and it was scheduled to start, but because of logistic problems, it didn't. One has to remember the Germans had actually reached Moscow. And the problem was, when they were there, unfortunately, the forward troops were there, but the logistic backup hadn't arrived. And it was bogged down in the snow. If that all had happened a month and a half earlier, they would probably have had the logistics in Moscow. And that could have been a very different state of affairs. The strange thing about Russian aviation is they had some brilliant designers, but Stalin had a peculiar attitude towards them. He was afraid that they might not concentrate their minds enough if they lived an ordinary life. So he arrested the lot. All their jet designers, their high-speed flight designers, their rocket designers, and put them in a gulag, but a 4-star gulag. Kept them in reasonable comfort, but they were imprisoned for 20 years. And he wanted them to all intermingle, learn a lot from each other, and maybe produce some wonderful ideas. Well, they certainly did. There was some wonderful research aircraft produced. But he wouldn't let them out, getting down to what he called production aircraft. He let the lower level produce many of these. And the reason for his attitude was he himself was scared stiff of flying. In his entire career as dictator, we only know of him flying once, and that was to the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Roosevelt. And the story is that on the return journey to Moscow, they ran into some bad weather, and the aircraft had a sudden drop when it got into a pocket of air, and this so scared the wits out of him that he vowed never to fly again. And he never did. And it's astonishing when you think of the huge distances involved in Russia. And here was the man holding the reins, and you'd think he wanted to go to every part of Russia and learn all about it, and he wouldn't fly.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.